If you build it, they will come. Certainly worked well for the mythical ballpark that Kevin Costner built in the Field of Dreams. But no one has come to a railroad that you built in the New Mexico desert. You paid millions for miles and miles of track on which no train has ever run and none ever will. Tonight, News 13 investigative reporter Larry Barker exposes the Excess Express.
Hey, look yonder coming down that railroad track.
This is a ghost story of sorts, and it begins with a railroad that should have been, but never was.
All aboard! Welcome to the Nowhere Express, a railroad that doesn't go anywhere. There are no passengers, no tickets, no schedules, no stations, no freight. In fact, there are no trains. You see, the government spent millions of dollars building this railroad. It took them the better part of a year. But shortly after they drove in the last spike, they decided to abandon the project.
The railroad spur was built approximately 30 years ago in the initial conceptual design concept of WIP.
It's called the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, WIP for short. Located 26 miles southeast of Carlsbad, this sprawling facility is the nation's only repository for defense-related radioactive waste, the byproducts of weapons production and nuclear research, protective gear, tools, glassware, and other items contaminated with man-made radioactive materials, including plutonium. Because this material remains radioactive for thousands of years, it is stored at WIP in 56 giant underground caverns excavated more than 2,000 feet below the surface. Each storage room is 100 yards in length, big enough to accommodate a regulation-sized football field. The radioactive material stored here comes from Department of Energy sites across the country, including Los Alamos, Rocky Flats in Colorado, and the Savannah River site in South Carolina. In 1979, Congress authorized construction of WIP at Carlsbad as a defense-related waste repository.
In 1980, the government decided to ship 75% of the radioactive waste to WIP by rail. So in October '83, they began construction on an 8-mile-long railroad spur carved out of the desert landscape here in southeast New Mexico. The project was completed a year later at a cost to taxpayers of $3.6 million.
That was 30 years ago. Since opening in 1999, more than 11,000 shipments of radioactive waste from all over the country have been transported to WIP. On average, that's about 30 loads a week. According to the original plan, this railroad should be very busy with trainloads of radioactive material destined for permanent storage.
So, according to the schedule, the next train should be by here never.
Casey Cadbury is the director of site operations.
Since it was built, has it ever been used to transport waste?
No, it has not.
You see, after spending millions of dollars designing, engineering, and building this railroad, the government changed its mind about using rail to transport nuclear waste. The DOE decided it would be less expensive to ship by truck. And just like that, trains were out, trucks were in. Today, custom-designed trailers use public highways to transport waste shipments to the WIP site.
In the end, it is not more cost-effective to ship transuranic waste by rail.
Once the government decided to abandon trains in favor of trucks, this 8-mile stretch of railroad was abandoned as well.
Does WIP still maintain the railroad spur?
No, WIP does not maintain the rail spur because once the decision was made to not ship high-level waste, then it was an opportunity to reevaluate to save the taxpayer dollars. The rail spur maintenance was not continued.
So what happens to railroad tracks that sit idle for decades? Well, they actually have a name for it. It's called a sun kink. Scorching southeast New Mexico heat can actually distort and buckle even the sturdiest steel. Today, it's rendered these rails into useless scrap.
Could that spur be used today to transport waste to the site?
Not in the current condition that it's in, no.
Is there any usefulness of the railroad spur to WIP today?
Currently, there is not because we're not using it at this time.
The government officials who spent millions building a railroad they would never use are long gone. It's the end of the line for the Nowhere Express. Larry Barker, KRQE News 13.
Adjusted for inflation, that original $3.6 million spent on the WIP railroad is now about $8.4 million.